Okay, good morning. It's Friday and you're with the House Human Services Committee. This morning, we're going to be taking up a walkthrough of H91, which is a bill regarding homeless services and emergency shelter support for individuals who are homeless. This is in follow-up to our previous hearing around the task force report from their work during the summer and fall. And we're going to have Katie McClinn here to walk us through the bill. A couple of things I want to say because I'm going to forget them if I don't. For committee members, we assigned committee liaisons to various committees. If you would be sure to check in with that committee chair, let them know that you're the liaison to their committee. That would be helpful because, for instance, I know there's some things in energy and digital infrastructure that are happening next week, and I forgot who is the liaison to energy and digital infrastructure, but please just check in with the committee chairs to let them know that you are the liaison to their committee. And then also take a look each week at their agendas and see if there's something popping up. I have to say, Doug gets the gold star because he's already talked to his counterpart around something that came up here in our committee. And so that process really works. And thank you for doing that. That's on the top of my brain. So, okay, Katie, we're going to do introductions because we have a couple of folks in the room who haven't been here previously. So we'll go around the room and do introductions. My name is Teresa Wood. I am from Waterbury and I also serve Bolton, Beaufort, and Huntington.
Dan Donahue from Northfield and also represent Berlin.
Morning, Dan Noyes. I represent Belvedere, Woolkit, Hyde Park, and Johnson.
Hi, good morning, Representative Eric McGuire, Rutland City.
Representative Steady, East Milton, Westford.
Doug Bishop, Colchester's Chittenden 20 District.
Morning, Todd Nielsen. I represent Brandon and Farmsdale.
Jubilee McGill, and I represent Bridgeport, Middlebury, New Haven, and Weybridge.
Good morning, Regular Fano, Essex and Essex Junction.
Very much to the assistant. Brenda Siegel, Executive Director of Advocates Vermont. Beverly Belkat, Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance.
Hannah Martog from Monty
Deputy Group Action Circles.
Monica McNair, Director of Communications and Legislative Services. Nellie Marvel, Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs for CF Central Office. Katie Regan,
I'm sorry, did you say?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
I'm sorry. Katie Regan,
Okay, thank you, Katie. That's okay. I represent Cole.
hello, I'm Esme Cole and I represent Hartford.
Great, thank you. So Katie's gonna review the bill for us and floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Katie McClinn, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'll be walking through H91 this morning. As I alluded to yesterday, this committee, last biennium's iteration of this committee did a lot of work on crafting an emergency temporary shelter program bill. Some of the items that were part of that bill, that bill didn't cross the finish line, but some portions of it ended up in the budget. And that's in part what we looked at yesterday with the task force. So this bill is not a complete rerun of what passed out of this committee last year because some of those elements like the task force were taken out of this bill as they passed somewhere else. But this should look incredibly familiar for those folks who were in the room last year. So what does this do? This sets up a emergency temporary shelter program. Our first section has some legislative intent. And then we have some language that creates an advisory committee, a short-term advisory committee. And then we look at the actual language that sets up the program itself. So I'll dive into that. First is our legislative intent language. It's the intent of the General Assembly that the emergency temporary shelter program that's established in this bill is a step towards ensuring that unsheltered homelessness be eliminated in Vermont and interim shelter opportunities be available to provide a stable pathway to permanent housing for all Vermonters experiencing homelessness. Second, it's the intent that arbitrary time limits, night-by-night shelter, relocation between interim housing sites, and other disruptions in housing stability be eliminated. Third, that non-congregate housing be used to the greatest extent possible. Fourth, it's the intent that Vermont's emergency housing statutes, rules, policies, and practices incorporate housing first principles, trauma-informed practices, and emerging best practices, including immediate access to shelter without housing readiness requirements, and also voluntary supportive services designed to support housing stability. And it's the intent that Vermont increase the supply of interim shelter that is geographically and physically accessible to individuals with a disability and that addresses the range of needs among individuals with a disability. So that is the intent section. And then we get into the language about the program itself. So this, the organization is a little confusing because there are two effective dates. So this section 2 takes effect when the bill passes, as does the legislative intent section. The idea being that an advisory committee is in effect before the program itself is in effect, so it can help govern the process by which the program takes shape. So you'll have this section, which will become, which would take effect first. And then when we look at section 3, the rest of the program, that would take effect a year out. So what does this advisory committee look like? First, we have its creation. We're creating the advisory committee to provide advice and recommendations to the commissioner, meaning the commissioner of DCF, regarding the implementation, administration, and operation of the Emergency Temporary Shelter Program from the perspective of individuals with lived experience of homelessness. And then we turn to the membership. Each coordinated entry lead agency shall appoint an individual with lived experience of homelessness in Vermont to serve on the advisory committee established in this section. The advisory committee's membership shall reflect the growing diversity among Vermonters, including individuals who are Black, Indigenous, or persons of color, as well as with regard to socioeconomic status, geographic location, gender, sexual identity, and disability status. The advisory committee is to have the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of the department. And then we have language governing the meetings of that advisory committee. The commissioner is to call the first meeting on or before July 15th of this coming year. And the committee is to select a chair or co-chairs from among its members at the first meeting. A majority of the membership constitutes a quorum. And then we have language around compensation reimbursement. This is sort of the standard language that we currently use around per diems and reimbursement for expenses. So this would pay individuals for not more than 12 meetings, assuming they're not being paid by a separate employer to be at the meetings. And these payments are to be made from funds that are appropriated to the Department for Children and Families. And then we have language repealing this advisory committee. So this, as I said, is a short-term advisory committee. So the idea is that it would take effect, or it would start to form this July, beginning this July, and it would be repealed on July 1, 2029. The discussion among members of the committee last year was that this advisory committee, the 4 years, would kind of give an opportunity to get the program up and running. And then once the program is on more stable legs, the need for the advisory committee is that it may not be necessary anymore. So that is the reason for the repeal, at least as was discussed last year.
Maybe we can just stop for a moment here and just check in for any questions up till now. Remember, this is just about what you're reading on the page, not about the concepts, just making sure you understand what's being read on the page. Go ahead, Representative McGuire, and then Representative Bishop.
Yeah, could I get an example of what the an individual on the membership would look like? Are we speaking of somebody with lived experience that's engaged with a designated agency. So, for sake of an example, say they are, live experience homelessness, but are engaged with, say, the Homeless Prevention Center in Rutland. Is that who was designated to this, committee and membership?
Please direct questions to Ledge Council, just in terms of reading. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Um,
Oh, no, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
But that's what I do. I always look around. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure that you weren't expecting me to respond.
Oh, no.
I can respond, but trying to keep it the way it's supposed to be.
The person themselves doesn't necessarily have to have a relationship with the coordinated lead entry agency that is appointing them. So it's just that the appointment is coming through the coordinated lead entry agency. Presumably somebody they know who has experience of the lived experience of homelessness. And then based on the second sentence, trying to reflect or pull together a group that have diverse backgrounds, it would seem that the coordinated lead entry agencies would have to be in communication about who they're appointing.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Bishop.
I imagine this is something we've met these folks in the last week or two, but can you tell me, coordinated entry lead agency, how many such agencies are there? So I'm just trying to get a handle on the overall size of the membership of the group.
So that's something we'll talk about when we get to kind of like really understanding all the elements and members of this service system and the role of each one of them, the coordinating lead entry being one, but each region has to have one.
Okay, so now we're turning to section 4. And this is the creation of the program itself. For those who are sort of trying to understand how the pieces would fit together, the advisory council that we just looked at would be a section in this chapter, and it would be a section in this chapter for a temporary period, and then it would go away. So this line 8 is not underlined because we've already created the chapter for the purpose of creating the advisory committee itself. So now we're amending that chapter a year later to add this new language. So first we have a definition section. The commissioner means the Commissioner for Children and Families. Community-based shelter means shelter that meets Vermont's Housing Opportunity Grant Program standards of provision of assistance. The department is DCF. Household means an individual and any dependents for whom the individual is legally responsible and who live in Vermont. Household includes individuals who reside together as one economic unit, including those who are married, parties to a civil union, or unmarried. So that's the same definition that was used in the budget for emergency housing this year. Statewide vacancy rate means the Vermont-specific rental vacancy rate as reported by the U.S. Census Bureau. And then we move into section 2202 at the top of page 5, and this establishes the program itself. So we're establishing emergency temporary shelter program within DCF for the purpose of temporarily sheltering households pursuant to the eligibility criteria that we'll look at in the next section, in a manner that ensures participant dignity and leads to greater stability. Permissible shelter provided through this program shall include A, community-based shelter provided by housing and shelter operators, including community-based shelters for designated populations, and hotel and motel rooms only after the department has exhausted other means of providing community-based shelter, and limit relocation between community-based shelter sites. So that, again, that concept of the community-based shelters first, and then moving to a hotel or motel is similar to the concept that was in the budget this year. In subsection C, if there is an adequate community-based shelter space available for a household within the AHS district in which the household presents itself, the household shall be provided shelter in a hotel or motel within the district, if available, until adequate community-based shelter space becomes available in the district. Then annually, the department is to propose hotel and motel rates through the budget process for consideration and approval by the General Assembly. If the department determines that a contractual agreement with a hotel or motel operator or secure temporary emergency shelter capacity to secure the capacity is beneficial to improve the quality, cleanliness, or access to services for those households temporarily sheltered in the facility, the department shall be authorized to enter into such an agreement in accordance with the per room rate established by the General Assembly, provided, however, that in no event shall such an agreement cause the household to become unhoused. The department may include provisions to address access to services or related needs within the contractual agreement. That language also was in the budget this year. And then we have language about sort of the standards of what has to be in place for hotels and motel rooms. So the use of a hotel or motel room is to be contingent on a participating motel or hotel room complying with the Public Accommodation Act, holding a lodging license issued by the Vermont Department of Health, and complying with the licensed lodging establishment rule and the Vermont Fire Building and Safety Code. The department may withhold full or partial payment to any hotel or motel operator who violates a law or statute or whose lodging license is suspended, revoked, expired, or otherwise invalid. Specifically, the department may withhold full or partial payment to a household or motel operator to whom the department has issued a conditional license, abatement order, warning letter, or other notice of violation. Likewise, the department may withhold full or partial payment to a hotel or motel operator who has received notices from other state agencies that indicate the hotel or motel operator has violated a law or rule. Once the department is satisfied that the hotel or motel operator is complying with the law and any corresponding rules, the department shall begin or resume payments at the contracted rate for lodging once the violation has ended. The department may provide all, some, or none of the payments withheld based on the nature and extent of the legal violations and the effects of those violations on the temporary, emergency temporary shelter program households.
Any questions on how hotel and motel participates and under what conditions? Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
Trying to see if there's something that's contradictory in the language, or very well may be my understanding of the definition of shelter. But in section 1, number 3, it talks about the non-congregate housing being used to the greatest extent possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then in section 4, when we get into B1B, hotel and motel rooms only used after exhausting other means of providing community-based shelter.
Mm-hmm. So, did I cut you off? I have two thoughts.
Please.
In section 1, is that where you are looking at the language that you first read?
Yes.
So that's legislative intent language, which is aspirational. So that is sort of the lofty goals of the General Assembly in bringing forward this program, but not necessarily binding in the way the other statutory language is. Also, the community-based shelter does not necessarily mean that it is a congregate shelter. There could be a community-based shelter that's non-congregate in nature, and I think you'll probably be hearing testimony as to what types of shelter options are available in Vermont, I think. Yeah.
Any other questions on this? Okay, thank you, Katie.
Yep. Okay, so now we're moving to, if you're following along, we're on page 7. We're halfway down the page in section 2203, household eligibility. So again, this list will look familiar to you. To be eligible for the program established in this chapter, the household shall attest to lack of a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence and have a member who. So they'll have a member who is 60 years of age or older, an eligible household. we'll have a member that is, that has a disability that can be documented. And then we go into the list of ways that the disability can be documented. So it could be documented by written verification of the disability from a professional licensed in the state to diagnose and treat the disability, and certification that the disability is expected to be long continuing or of indefinite duration and substantially impedes the individual's ability to live independently. It could be written verification from the Social Security Administration, receipt of a disability check, intake, staff recorded observation of a disability that not later than 45 days after the application for assistance is confirmed and accompanied by evidence of this. Or in subdivision A, could be another documentation approved by either the department or U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Continuing on with our eligibility list, an eligible household could attain eligibility if a person is experiencing a serious short-term medical condition or has been discharged from a healthcare facility where the household was being treated for a serious short-term medical condition within the last 30 days. The household has a child under 19 years of age. The household has a member that's in the third trimester of pregnancy or is experiencing an at-risk pregnancy. The household has a member who's experienced the death of a spouse or domestic partner within the last 30 days. The household has a member who's experienced a natural disaster such as a flood, fire, hurricane within the last 30 days. The household has a member that is under court-ordered eviction or constructive eviction due to circumstances over which the household had no control. Or lastly, there's a member of the household who's experiencing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, hate violence, or other dangerous or life-threatening conditions that relate to violence against the individual or household.
I think we have a question back on the first part of this eligibility section. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes, the intro to it, to be eligible. The phrase fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. The implication there is that that's how we're defining homelessness. But was there a choice or a reason to not simply have a definition that defines what we mean by homelessness? This is what they're attesting to.
Yeah.
But we've never said this means we consider them homeless.
Yeah. You know, I'm trying to remember the conversation last year and I don't know, I can't remember the conversation specifically. But I take your point that is another way of
Realizing that.
Yeah.
that you could have a definition of what is homeless and then use it in this sentence. Yeah.
I know why, but maybe it's too much. I kind of remember.
When we get to
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so now I'm on page 9, top of page 9, section 2204. And this is where we talk about maximum days of eligibility. So the maximum number of days that a household receives shelter in a motel or hotel under this program for a 12-month period shall be determined by the statewide vacancy rate. If the statewide vacancy rate is less than 5% at the household's time of application, the household shall receive a maximum of 90 shelter days under this program for the 12-month period. If the statewide vacancy is equal or greater to 5% of the household's time at the household's time of application, the household shall receive a maximum of 45 shelter days under the program. And then there are no periods of ineligibility imposed on the use of the household's maximum permitted shelter days. Then we move to household participation. So unless the head of a household has a disability, as evidenced in one of the ways that we just looked at in section 2202, that prevents the head of the household's ability to participate and coordinated entry and case management processes. A participating household sheltered pursuant to this chapter shall participate in coordinated entry and case management processes if temporary emergency shelter in excess of 14 days is required, including cooperating with the department and service providers on screening and care planning. Then we have what the application process looks like. We have language about notices that a household receives and appeal rights. So all program applicants and notices shall use plain language. In subsection B, the department shall provide written notice and notice in the household's preferred form of communication of appeal rights related to the departmental decisions made in the course of administering the program established in this chapter, including appeal rights related to the denial of an initial application. A household sheltered in accordance with this program may continue to remain sheltered while the appeal is pending until the household's maximum shelter days for the current 12-month period have expired. So if there's appeal pending, the person can stay housed. We have reporting requirements. Monthly, the department shall post the following on its website: the annual total and average monthly number of households participating in the program by household size, by eligibility category, and by each AHS district. The number of alternative housing placements made during the previous reporting period compared with the targeted number of placements for that period. The number of households successfully placed in alternative housing during the previous month. The number of households whose screening indicated a potential need for services from each department within the AHS, within the Agency of Human Services. The report shall include the number of beds available for emergency housing in each AHS district in the state, with separate reporting on the number of beds available in nursing homes and residential care homes for individuals whose screening indicates they could meet the clinical criteria for those settings, and the number of emergency beds available for individuals whose screening indicates they do not meet the clinical criteria, including low barrier shelters, beds for youth, and beds for individuals who have experienced domestic violence. Report shall look at the number of households that have been successfully transitioned to alternative housing placements since the previous report was issued, and the type of housing settings to which they have been placed. In subdivision 6, the report will look at the outlook for transitioning additional households to alternative housing placements in the coming months, including an estimate of the number of households likely to be placed per month. It will address the number of and demographic information for households obtaining shelter due to adverse weather conditions pursuant to section 2208 of this chapter. And lastly, it will look at the total amount of funds expended during the most recent quarter on housing placements and supportive services for households transitioning from the program established in this chapter. So those are all monthly reporting requirements that will be on the department's website were this to pass. And then we have language about winter shelter. So to the extent funding and capacity exists, and notwithstanding any provisions of the chapter to the contrary, the department is to provide shelter to households lacking a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence between November 15th and April 15th. If there is inadequate community-based shelter within the AHS district in which the household presents itself, the household shall be provided shelter in a hotel or motel within the district, if available, until adequate community shelter space becomes available. Shelter in a hotel or motel provided pursuant to this section does not count towards the maximum days of eligibility per 12-month period. That's what we looked at, the maximum times that are based on the vacancy rate.
So Katie, can you sort of maybe for people who might not be familiar with the frequent use in legislation of the term notwithstanding and what that means sort of in layman's language?
Sure. So when we're using notwithstanding, we're saying that if there is other statutory language in this chapter that conflicts with this section that we're looking at here, this section will take precedence over that.
Maybe, yeah, go ahead. Amy.
So, I'm trying to cross-check with what we already, what's already drafted there in terms of the, the eligibility group or what's, yeah, household eligibility, in other words, non-winter shelter. This makes it clear that, you know, to the extent funding is available, the department shall provide shelter to any of these households. Is there a part that identifies that, assuming funding and capacity, that the department shall provide shelter for these eligible households around the year if they meet all the criteria? I don't see any kind of parallel language putting any requirement on the department to actually do this program. It might be somewhere I missed as we're reading it through.
I'm not totally following your question. Can you try me again?
Yes, we create this program in the first section in terms of eligible households and what they're eligible for. But being eligible doesn't necessarily say the department has to have the program and is required to provide
It's
those.
an affirmative statement. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand what you're trying to get at.
Whereas for winter shelter, we say the department shall
Making an
provide
affirmative
shelter.
statement.
They must do it,
See what you're saying?
limited by, you know, but we don't say that for the non-winter program. Or that's what I was asking.
Yeah, I get-
Do
I
we
see what
or
you're saying.
yeah,
I see what
okay.
you're saying.
We do, apparently we do not, but that's.
Right.
good to
That's
know
clear.
for-
You noted?
Yeah. I got my notes here. Yeah.
Okay, should I keep going?
Yes.
Oh, there's a,
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Go ahead.
In the reporting section,
yeah.
perhaps I'm missing it, but is there anything that asks for data on the average length of stay? Talks about people moving, how many moved out from our past program in the last month? Or historically, has there been any inclusion last year that you can recall on sort of an average length of stay data?
I'm looking, I don't know off the top of my head. I'm gonna change it. Successfully placed. Interesting, no, I'm not seeing that.
Okay, thank you.
I want to write both of these things down. Let's stay data. Affirmative statement. Okay. I am moving down to section 5, which is on page 12, if you have a part. Just for continued education on reading bills, line 15 has those ellipses that indicates that something is missing. So what is missing something is missing that is not being changed. So what is missing that's not being changed is the advisory council that was enacted the previous year. So that's just holding the place for it and saying that's still here and we're not changing it. Section 5 is rulemaking language. So by February 15th of 2026, the department is to file an initial permanent proposed rule with the Secretary of State for the administration of this program. Prior to the adoption of the permanent rule, the department is to file an emergency rule, which shall be deemed to have met the emergency rulemaking standard in statute to enable the operation of the program, the temporary shelter program, to begin on July 1 of 26.
This is for my education. Is there such thing as an initial permanent proposed rule?
Shall file an initial permanent. I think the initial is there. No, there's no such thing as initial permanent.
Initial, yeah.
as opposed to one that's being amended. Maybe it's more meant to be initially, they shall propose a rule, a permanent proposed rule in
Oh, I see.
advance of when the program is starting, so that the rules have time to work their way through the administrative rulemaking process. But we could certainly wordsmith that. And
Emergency rule. Okay.
should I just talk a little bit about this
Yeah.
process a little bit? So often when General Assembly enacts a statute for the creation of a program or the administration of a program, there are smaller details that the agency needs to work out to operate the program. For example, what exactly is in the application? What exactly does that look like? When exactly are we providing you notice of these different details? So there's a rulemaking process often after a program is adopted, whereby the agency is drafting rules for the administration of the program. And then the rules have to be looked at by different entities. So it goes to ICAR first after it's filed with the Secretary of State, which is interagency. Thank you. And then it eventually makes its way to LCAR, which is the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. At LCAR, that's the opportunity for the legislature to weigh in to say, yes, this does meet our legislative intent, or no, this actually does not meet our legislative intent. And, you know, even if it doesn't meet, if the committee says it doesn't meet our legislative intent, that doesn't mean the rule can't go forward. It means that if it's challenged, the court looking at it, their standard, the burden shifts. So that's probably more complicated than we need to get into.
Yeah, but that
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
raises an interesting question. If it doesn't meet the intent, is there any sort of level of, does it substantially meet? I mean, if it's way off base, it can still go into effect, even though it's fairly contrary to the legislative intent?
Yes, I mean, LCAR doesn't have the authority to stop the rule. They have the authority to object to the rule. Often, what goes hand in hand with an objection is a memo from the committee outlining their concerns. So maybe that would be a point where the concerns of, you know, the degree of seriousness of the concerns would be outlined. But I would guess that if something is seriously undermining the intent of the General Assembly, that there would probably be litigation.
That's what Ann just whispered in my ear.
And that lines up much better for the complainant if
If
LCAR
there's been an
has-
objection, yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of which, do you know what LCAR did yesterday on the proposed rule?
Yes, they did nothing because the department asked for 2 weeks to reconsider some positions.
Okay, which they've been given multiple weeks already, I have to say, on the same. So there's emergency rules in place right now, and there's permanent rules for the existing program in quotes before the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. I issued a memo indicating that based on the testimony that we had taken, that there were provisions of that rule that did not, in my estimation, meet legislative intent. I believe the LCAR agrees with that and has asked the department on actually multiple occasions now to reconsider those sections of the rules. So they failed to take action yesterday. And that's what Katie, that's the question I was just asking Katie about, was an update on that. Yeah, go ahead, Rep. Steady.
What is LCAR?
Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules.
All these, we were going to get a list.
You have it.
Oh, it's on my iPad.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Paper.
Okay, you can print it out.
Once.
So the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules is kind of the last step in the rulemaking process. So you will see, so in this draft legislation, we charge the department with establishing rules. So that is so the public knows what to expect from that program. Okay, so we set out the policy here in whatever bill that we pass. They fill in the details. What we have probably learned from this process over the course of this year is that there are some things that we will probably need to be more explicit about in the legislation that eventually leaves our committee. Because there's been, I think, in my personal opinion, because what they're putting forth right now does not meet legislative intent, an interpretation, I guess, if you will, from the department about how to implement the program. When that sort of disagreement happens, what we end up tending to do is to be more specific in the policy, which is could be avoided. Okay, Katie. I think we're pretty much at the end.
Almost there, yep. We have language, so I guess I haven't said this here before. So there is statutory, I'm on section 6, if folks are following along. So in the Green Books, codified is a chapter on general assistance. Last biennium, last year, this committee wanted a presentation of what was in that chapter, specifically looking for what was said about housing, GA emergency housing in that chapter. And it turns out really not much is said at all. It's mostly in session law where we're dealing with emergency housing. However, there is this one report that's mostly focused on housing. And because the idea is this emergency shelter would stand in place of GA emergency housing, a GA emergency housing report would no longer be necessary. So that is why this codified report would be eliminated under this proposal. Section 7, we have a sunset language. So the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program would cease to exist on July 1, 26, when the Emergency Temporary Shelter Program just takes effect. And all related rules would become ineffective on that date, including the GA rule as amended. This is outdated now, but as amended by the permanent rule going into effect. Although I think we should think about this more carefully, because as I was just saying, GA is bigger than emergency housing. There are some portions of the GA rule that we would need to retain. So we'd have to be more specific about which sections of the GA rule are sunsetting.
Yeah, I think our intent was to honestly kind of like extract the emergency shelter program from general assistance and create a separate thing for it. So, to the extent that there are other things in the general assistance, like, assistance, I don't know, there are burial assistance and, a bunch of other smaller things in there that, the intent would be that would continue to exist, but that this would be separate from that. Okay, so that was a lot to take in, and
We haven't done it,
oh,
which is where I had a question. So,
sorry.
The effective dates.
Sorry, I never pay attention to effective dates. I'm sorry.
So we have
They are important.
the effective date section, the legislative intent, and the advisory advisory committee taking effect on passage. And then everything else is taking effect on July 1, 26.
Go ahead.
What am I forgetting?
so I guess maybe not right now, but I need some clarity. And I guess I could go back and do a long side-by-side reading the budget, but obviously we have a gap between the end of the current budget year and what we budgeted for emergency housing, which is July 1 of 2025 and July 1 of 2026.
Yeah.
So
What happens in the?
is there something in the interim already in place?
No, it would have to be a budget package this year, like
Okay.
kind of maintaining the status quo of negotiating a package every year.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right. So
I
that's
mean-
an important thing we need to,
either that or we
Also
set up
doing-
a temporary we tried to do something temporary, the bridge. In this, we could try to do the bridge in this bill.
Right, we need a bridge, basically.
There's a bridge,
We
right?
need to, yeah,
That's a good
okay,
point. Yeah, I mean, what exists in the budget right now ends on, July.
right. So if we did
First,
nothing but
June
this bill
There
and
would
we
be a
did
whole
nothing
year.
else, there'd be a year where there was nothing.
Right, right.
It's
Not the intent, right?
right.
Yeah. So,
And Chair,
yes, go ahead.
one last question. Going back, there was language here about whether a hotel motel may be out of compliance and the possibility of the state withholding funds.
Mhm.
And once the objections of the state have been cleared up, they can still withhold and only make partial payment. Right, back in the very end of section 2202. Department may provide all, some, or none of the payments withheld based on the nature and extent of the legal violations. Page 7, lines 4 through 7.
Page 7, lines 4 through 7.
Yeah,
Okay.
so my question relates to, is there language elsewhere or anything that would prohibit the motel, should they not get full payment after the violation is taken care of, if the state still withholds money? Is there anything that prevents them from going after the individuals, the households that are occupying the rooms?
No, not in this, not as drafted. No. But I'm imagining that some of the, like, continue to withhold or not provide the whole payment is the room was damaged, only a portion of the room or services that were supposed to be provided as having access to the room were provided, so we're not gonna pay you the whole rate. The shower didn't work, there wasn't running water, something like that is sort of what I envisioned, being able to continue to withhold the payment and not have to return a full payment even after the shower or whatever is fixed.
The department has some recent experience with this, so when we have them in to testify, we can ask them about their experience with this. Other questions about what Katie's just reviewed with us? She said at the beginning, this is based on the bill that we passed last year. In the interim, this was just kind of really to get something on the wall for us to start with. As we've talked about several times now, whatever we start with is never what we end with. We have the recommendations of the task force that we'll be talking about and discussing. We'll be taking a boatload of testimony on this because it's obviously, there's a lot of eyes on this, and we need to, make sure that we are taking into consideration all aspects of what we're looking at. One of the things that we didn't do in this bill, even though as I'm rereading it today, it's not necessarily excluded, but we didn't address it specifically in the bill, and that's the presence of community-run shelters, and really looking at this as an overarching shelter program that has different elements in it. And it focuses a lot on sort of what happens if those things aren't available, but we don't really focus on sort of, I guess, what some people call a continuum of services in the shelter. And I think that, in thinking about this and thinking about the recommendations from the task force and sort of thinking about this in the course of the last year, we really kind of have a system of folks who get more wraparound support, who don't have any time limits on the amount of time that they can stay. Each individual shelter is run as each individual shelter. And yet a person with the same needs who by virtue of timing doesn't right now have access to any of those same things that people who are accessing community-based shelters have access to, which I think is something that we really need to sort of dig into and think about. And so And the other thing that, just, so people sitting around the table and listening, this is not going to be a bill that does not consider resources. So we don't have unlimited pocketbook in the state, and we need to think about something that's going to be sustainable, and something that is, going to be able to be done within the resources that we have. And that might mean some shifts and changes, and I think we just need to be open to what that dialogue is going to be about in our committee. So, so Katie can do other things. Did people have any other thoughts for Katie or questions? Because then I thought we could discuss a little bit what we heard yesterday during testimony and sort of where people are thinking about questions that they'd like to see answered as we go through this process, which will take some time, and there'll be a lot to discuss. But in the meantime, does anybody have anything specifically for Katie? Katie, do you have somebody? Is this an interview? I'm not sure. Oh, you're not. Okay, she's sitting in your spot, so that's why I wasn't sure. Okay, that's because I know sometimes you have an intern. I wasn't sure if that was one. Okay, okay. All right. Thank you, Katie, so much.
Yep.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You as well.
All right. Okay, so let's just take a brief till 11:15 break, and we'll come back and have some discussion about yesterday's testimony and where people kind of want to head with